Okay, today's daf is daf Samach Tes 69, and we are at the bottom of Samach Ches Amud Beis 68b. The conversation we've been having is about somebody who lives in a alleyway or a courtyard together with a non-Jew, and or somebody who forgot to make an eruv, forgot to participate by putting bread in. So we have for a Jew who partakes in Shabbos, so the eruv is relevant to him, so he would have to put a bread in. He didn't put a bread in, so he has to relinquish his rights in the courtyard. However, for a non-Jew who does not partake in Shabbos, Shabbos is of no significance to them, so for them, they don't have to partake in the eruv, and they can't actually partake in the eruv, it's not a part of that, but what we do is we lease the land, or their rights to the land, from them, and then we have the same concept of a unified space of under one unified space, and therefore it's going to count as an eruv. The Mishnah brought the case of a tzeduki, a Sadducee. The tzedukim did not believe in Torah Shabbal Peh, did not follow halacha as we have it, and rather they were a break-off group from the halachic establishment. There was another group like that called Baitusim, and also similarly a break-off. Now, the distinction between the two is unclear, but they were both basically had the same concept of that eruv does not exist. This is a rabbinic matter, and they did not follow the rabbinics at all. And now, if you live in a courtyard with someone like that, what's the halacha? Do we say that after all they don't participate in eruv? To them, eruv is non-existent. They don't follow Torah as it is, and so therefore they should not be a part of eruv, and they should have the same halacha as non-Jews in regards to this idea of participating in an eruv. That they can't just relinquish their rights to the courtyard. That we would have to lease it from them, or they'd have to give the space over. So in the Mishnah, it said that Rabbi Gamliel had told his children that he reported that his father had said that when the tzeduki allowed them to have the rights to his section in the courtyard, that we could just lease that. We should just do something to solidify that by bringing some vessels out from the house, and that would be sufficient. The Gemara asks, who mentioned tzeduki in the Mishnah to begin with? Tzeduki man dechar shemei. This is about 15 lines from the bottom of 68b. Samach Ches Amud Beis. Tzeduki man dechar shemei. Who mentioned tzeduki that we're even talking about this? So Chasurim Mechzer Machaktani. So the Gemara says that the Mishnah is actually missing the context for this, and here's how it should have read. Tzeduki harehu kanachri. The first opinion says that tzeduki is like a non-Jew. You have to lease the land from him, and it's not sufficient for him to relinquish ownership because he's not a part of eruv and Shabbos because he doesn't partake in that. And in the first opinion, Rabbi Gamliel says that tzeduki is not like a nachri, and he could relinquish ownership. And Rabbi Gamliel told a story of a tzeduki that lived in his neighborhood in the same alleyway in Yerushalayim. And our father said to us, quickly go ahead and bring some of the vessels, our vessels, out into the courtyard, into the alleyway, showing that we accept and acquire the relinquishment that he has made towards us of his rights in the courtyard or alleyway. Because otherwise, when he brings something out on Shabbos, that's going to prohibit because that'll be like reneging on the relinquishment. And as we'll see soon in the Gemara, what Gamliel is saying over here is that we see that as soon as they did something to show that they acquire and accept the relinquishment, he can no longer renege. Vatanya, indeed, we learned like this. The first opinion says if you live with a non-Jew in the courtyard or alleyway, or with the tzeduki or baitusi, then you will now have someone who doesn't partake in Shabbos, and you have to lease the land from them, and if not, they prohibit the eruv from taking effect. And there was a story with such a person in Tzeduki, they lived in the courtyard of Rabbi Gamliel. But Amar lahem Rabbi Gamliel labanav, and Rabbi Gamliel said to his children, "B'anai, my children, maharu v'tziim ashatem v'tziim, bring out from the house that which needs to be brought out, and or bring in something from the courtyard that needs to be brought in, or from the alleyway, before this disgraced person brings something out. Because if he does, he will have shown that he reneges and on his relinquishment, and he now retakes his rights in the courtyard or the alleyway, and it will invalidate the Eruv. And it will invalidate the Eruv. He's not allowed to carry. Because he had relinquished his rights to the courtyard or to the alleyway to you. And if you don't firm that up, if you don't solidify that by an action, he can renege. Divrei Rabbi Meir, that's Rabbi Meir's recollection of that particular story. However, Rabbi Yehuda says, no, it was a different way. And Rabbi Gamliel is not disagreeing that just as you have to lease the land from a non-Jew because he doesn't partake in Eruv, so too from a Tzedukim Beitusi, you have to lease the land back. They cannot relinquish because they're not a part of Eruv. However, what he said to them was something else. It was prior to Shabbos, and he said to them, quickly go ahead and solidify the lease we have from him, because if we don't do that before Shabbos, then we will enter Shabbos without a valid Eruv. Go quickly do what you need in the courtyard before the sun goes down, because then it will prohibit. Amar. So the first analysis of the statement would say the teacher had taught, go ahead quickly. In Rabbi Meir's opinion, he said, go ahead and quickly solidify the acquisition or the relinquishment that he made towards us in the courtyard of the alleyway, so that we can carry, and because it's a unified body that owns this space right now, and not multiple people, and because we made an error of everybody joined in the meal. So he said, go ahead and bring out from the house things that you need, or bring in from the alleyway that which you need, before he brings stuff out and will prohibit it. Lememra. So what we're saying is that if the people of the courtyard, first go ahead and bring something out into the courtyard or into the alleyway, they show that they have acquired the relinquishment and the rights to the courtyard, and he no longer can renege. But even if he carries stuff out, but we learned in the Mishnah, but we learn in the Mishnah that if somebody relinquished their rights and then they bring something out of the house into the courtyard, whether intentionally or not, it's going to ruin their relinquishment. It's like they renege, and now they again invalidate the Eruv, because there are multiple entities here, because they now are an entity in the courtyard that has not participated in the Eruv. And the Mishnah doesn't make a distinction of whether or not it's been solidified. This opinion of Rabbi Meir, Amar Rav Yosef. So Rav Yosef says, Ema Eino Oser. Perhaps what we have to read in the Mishnah is Eino Oser. It does not invalidate it. However, Abai says no. You're right, and here's the Mishnah is talking about in a case where no one solidified, and the Brisa is talking about where they did solidify. Where they did some form of acquisition of that right by putting the furniture in or removing furniture, so they showed ownership, and therefore they acquire the rights that he relinquished to them. And the Mishnah is talking about where they did not do something to acquire and solidify that acquisition, and therefore, even though he relinquished, once he carries something out, that's called reneging, and therefore it will invalidate the Eruv. But Tanya, indeed, we learn like this clearly in a Brisa. The Brisa is going to give us three scenarios, and the first one is unclear exactly what that case is. I'm going to give you Rashi and Tosfos. Matani we learned. Actually, if someone had not relinquished their rights yet, okay, so there are five households in this courtyard. Four of them joined in a meal. And everybody put a bread in. The bread is in apartment A in this courtyard. Great. So now that's considered a single entity. But there's one person who did not participate. That invalidates the Eruv because you now have multiple entities. The Eruv entity where everybody joined in a meal and the one person who did not join in. So if prior to relinquishing his ownership, he's not allowed to carry into the courtyard, but he did. So the remedy would have been that he can relinquish ownership, but he didn't do that. In fact, what he did was he brought something, his lawn chair, from his house into the courtyard, and he solidified that he's maintaining his rights in the courtyard. So according to Tosfos, he can no longer renege that Shabbos because he's already shown that for this Shabbos he's maintaining his rights in the courtyard by bringing something out. That's the way Tosfos learns. Rashi says that no, we're talking since he broke Shabbos, he no longer has any rights, at least for this Shabbos, but he has no rights anymore to Shabbos and Eruv and relinquishing, and he's now in the same category as the Sadducee, as the Tzeduki, who cannot relinquish, and you have to lease from him, and obviously you'd have to lease before Shabbos. Tosfos disagrees with this because how can it be that on a single time that somebody breaks Shabbos, whether intentionally or unintentionally, that would count as disassociating them from Eruv and Shabbos? We know, as we'll see later in the Gemara, that it has to be that they do so publicly and audaciously, unabashedly. But if they have any sense of connection to Shabbos and attempts of making Shabbos, they would not be in this same category as a Sadducee or a non-Jew, and you'd have to lease from them. In any case, that's the interpretation of this first line, according to Rashi and according to Tosfos. So Tani actually nasa reshusah. Prior to relinquishing his rights, he already brought something from the house into the courtyard. And by doing so, as we explained according to Tosfos, he's shown that he maintains his rights to the courtyard for the Shabbos. Whether he did so intentionally or unintentionally, he can relinquish his rights. According to Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda Eimer b'shogeg yachal levatel, b'mezid eini yachal levatel. However, Rabbi Yehuda says no. If he did so intentionally, he can no longer relinquish his rights. Only if he did so unintentionally can he relinquish his rights. However, second case, Misha Nasa Rishusa, he did relinquish his rights. And then prior to anybody else solidifying that with an action, he comes and he brings his lawn chair out. And then he brings something out, regardless if he did so intentionally or not. Oser. That's called reneging. That would be considered as if he no longer relinquished his rights. Rabbi Meir says it now invalidates the Eruv of everybody else. Rabbi Yehuda again says only if he did so intentionally. If he did so unintentionally, it doesn't count as he's reneging on his relinquishment. He still has relinquished his rights to the group, and therefore there's still only one entity in the courtyard. That's only if the alleyway people or the courtyard people, the inhabitants, no one made an acquisition of that relinquishment. But if they solidified it with an action, they brought their own lawn chair out first before the person who relinquished it, regardless of whether the person who originally gifted, relinquished his rights to the Eruv committee, he now brings his stuff out, even if he does so intentionally to renege on the relinquishment, doesn't make a difference. They've already established and acquired it, and he can no longer prohibit them from carrying in there because he can no longer take it back for this Shabbos. Amar Mar, the teacher further said, Rabbi Yehuda said no. Rabbi Gamliel, he considered the Sadducees, the Tzeduki and Batusi, as a non-Jew in regards to the Eruv and Shabbos, because they don't partake in Eruv, they don't partake in Shabbos, so they cannot be a part of the Eruv process. So they're like a non-Jew, you have to lease the land from them. And what Rabbi Gamliel said was a different thing. Before he goes down, comes out, which the Gemara is going to explain in a moment. Before he brings something out, you should bring something out to solidify the acquisition. because as soon as when nighttime comes, if you didn't lease the land from him, he will prohibit it to you. Alma Nachri. So we see that according to Rabbi Gamliel, that Tzeduki is going to be in the same halachic category in regards to Eruv as a non-Jew, because they don't partake in Eruv, they don't partake in Shabbos, they can't relinquish their rights. So when it says, wait, but it says before he takes it out, meaning, what does it mean he takes it out? You just try to be before him. It doesn't mean that before the sun sets. No, it means something else. It means before the sun goes down, before the day leaves. That's what I mean, not before he brings something out. Before the night comes and sends the day out. That's what it means. Or perhaps, Lakasha, that there's a distinction, and there are two scenarios, and it would depend on the level of someone's transgression of Shabbos. If somebody disregards Shabbos privately in their own home, they'll break Shabbos, but publicly they'll make attempts to observe Shabbos. So that counts as someone who observes Shabbos. But someone who audaciously and unabashedly break Shabbos publicly with no compunctions, that person is no longer participating in Shabbos, make no efforts in Shabbos, and therefore they don't partake in Eruv either, and they couldn't just relinquish their rights. You would have to lease it from them. So the Gemara says, so whose opinion is this? Mumar v'gil l'ponim. Somebody who is a mumar, which is this term for somebody who essentially abandons Torah and mitzvah. V'gil l'ponim, and someone who is a dashus. He can no longer relinquish his rights in a courtyard. So Gemara says, Gilu Panim, Mumar Avad. Just because somebody is audacious, is unabashed, does that make them relinquish lose their rights to the laws of Shabbos and Eruv? Ela Mumar Begilu Panim. Rather, it's one thing. It's not and. It's one term. Somebody who is a Mumar. That means that they are not willing to accept the obligations of Shabbos in its entirety. Not only that, but they do so unabashedly in public. They no longer are considered partaking in Shabbos and cannot relinquish their rights in the courtyard because they're not a part of Eruv. Come on, Rabbi Yehuda. Whose opinion is this? This is the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, who said that the Sadducee in Rabbi Gamliel's courtyard, Rabbi Gamliel considered like a non-Jew and felt that you have to lease from them and that they cannot relinquish. The first opinion, however, said, Rabbi Meir said, no, that since he's a Jew, even if he doesn't partake in Eruv, he can relinquish his rights, and it's just that you have to acquire it before he reneges. So the Gemara tells a story. Exactly what this is unclear. Rashi has multiple versions. There are other versions. We're going to go with Rashi's second version. He had basically a bag of spices that people would sometimes walk around with to mask a bad odor. And this person's walking around on Shabbos in a public domain carrying this scented bag. Once he saw Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya, not to be confused with Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, the compiler of the Mishnah, but Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya, his great grandchild, who is descendant, who was an Amora in the Gemara era. So he saw Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya coming, Kasyeh, so he hid it. He covered this bag so he doesn't see it. Now Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya saw it, but nevertheless, the attempt to make sure that it wasn't seen was enough, even though that he was publicly and almost unabashedly breaking Shabbos. But when he saw Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya, he was ashamed enough that he wanted to hide it. That was sufficient to count him as still connected to Shabbos, still observant of Shabbos to a degree, and therefore he can still partake in Eruv. Amar Kagon Zeh, or Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya said, somebody like this, Mavata Rishus Rabbi Yehuda, he counts as not, trying enough to observe Shabbos that he would, according to Rabbi Yehuda, still be able to relinquish his rights to the courtyard because he still partakes in Shabbos and Eruv. Amar Avuna, Eze Yisrael Mumar. So Rav Huna said, so what does count as a Yisrael Mumar, a Jew that has left Torah and mitzvah? He said, you know what it is? It's somebody who publicly and unabashedly and audaciously breaks Shabbos without any compunctions. Amar Rav Nachman Kaman. Rav Nachman says, based on whose opinion are you saying that? That's why he challenged Rav Huna. Ika Rabbi Meir, are you saying this according to Rabbi Meir? Well, Rabbi Meir actually doesn't say this only about Shabbos. It says anybody that breaks any one mitzvah without any compunctions, any one halacha, well, any one of the 613 mitzvahs. He says, you know what, I only have 610, 6.5, 6.12. That person is going to be considered a mumar, someone who has left Torah. Because he says if you're suspect as someone who does not observe one of the mitzvahs, is suspect about the rest of the whole of the Torah. So why do you pick Shabbos, somebody who breaks Shabbos without compunctions publicly, audaciously? But why don't we say any mitzvah? When somebody says, yeah, I'm eating my pork publicly, no, unabashedly, so then they're not a part of Torah mitzvah anymore. So it can't be according to Rabbi Meir. So who are you saying this according to the Rabbanan? Ika Rabbanan. Well, if it's according to the Rabbanan, they say it's not true. That somebody who is suspect about one aspect of Torah is not suspect about any other aspect of Torah. And then we turn to Samach Testament base. Unless he's completely dedicated to Avodah Zarah, meaning he doesn't care about Avodah Zarah, he'll do idolatry. Well, then that is the antithesis of all of Torah. If you have an idol, if you're doing idolatry, you are saying that Hashem is not God and the Torah is not Torah, and then you have no part of Torah. Amar Rav Nachman Yitzchak, Liter Rishus of Vater Rishus. So Rav Nachman Yitzchak responded that Rav Huna is not referring to the classic question of who's a mumar, who is or isn't in Torah. Rather, who's in Shabbos, who is connected enough to Shabbos that they have the rights to relinquish their courtyard space in order to make the rest of the Eruv work. That you have to partake in Shabbos, and if this person is a Mechal Shabbos before Hesia, publicly, unabashedly is breaking Shabbos without any compunctions, so then they are not partaking in Shabbos, and to that he says is a mumar that would not be able to relinquish their rights in the courtyard. Tanya, and like we learned, Yisrael mumar meshama shabbos b'shuk. Someone who breaks Shabbos, however, publicly, when he's in public, he keeps Shabbos. Mavata Rashus, he has a right to relinquish his space to the Eruv group because he at least publicly is showing a connection to Shabbos. But somebody who even in the public sphere that breaks Shabbos without any issues, he no longer is a part of the Eruv and cannot relinquish his rights to the Eruv. We'd have to lease it from him. Because we say a Jew can relinquish his rights in the courtyard or have it relinquished to him. And by a non-Jew, you have to lease it from him. And this person who has no connection to Shabbos or disassociated himself from Shabbos by publicly, unabashedly breaking Shabbos, he can no longer relinquish rights or have it relinquished. He's like a Nachri and has to have it leased from him. So how does this relinquishment work? The Brisa continues, Ketzad, what he would say to the rest of the group, Rishusi kanuya lacha, my land, my rights to the courtyard is acquired to you, bequeathed to you. Rishusi muvutelas lacha, my rights are relinquished, are negated to you. Kana, and he acquires it. But it doesn't have to do an action to acquire. So that's the first answer given on what Rav Huna meant, that somebody who breaks Shabbos publicly unabashedly is going to count as a mumar, and it's only in reference to the halachas of Shabbos, since he's no longer associating with Shabbos. So in regards to Shabbos halachas, he's not a part of Shabbos. However, Rav Ashi Amar Haitanu. Rav Ashi says, no, you're right. The first intent that you had is the correct one. That this opinion, Rav Huna is saying that someone who breaks Shabbos publicly unabashedly is equivalent to idolatry. And it's based upon not Rabbi Meir, who says any mitzvah that you break, it's like you break the whole Torah. and not according to the Chachamim who say, oh, only if you break, if you do idolatry, have you disassociated from Torah and Mitzvah. This concept of mumar equates Shabbos, a public, unabashed breaking of Shabbos, to idolatry, and it's this opinion. The Chamira le Shabbos Kavod Zarah, that he says that Shabbos is as strict and as severe as idolatry. Kedetani, we learned. The Torah says at the beginning of Vayikra, in regards to the bringing of korban of offerings in the Beis Hamikdash, it says, if a person shall bring close of a person shall bring close of yourselves a korban to Hashem, of animals, of cattle, of sheep. Now, there's a couple of superfluous words there. It says, Adam, a man, a person. It should just say, ki yakriv. Why does it have to say Adam? So that tells us a non-Jew can also bring a korban. Anybody, even a non-Jew. It says, Adam. Ki yakriv, it brings close. Mikem, of you. Of you, Am Yisrael. Not all of the Jews can bring a korban. There's an exclusion. Some cannot bring a korban. But only mikem, only some of you cannot bring a korban. But the non-Jew, any non-Jew can bring a korban. So the Gemara says, mikem, what is that drash? What does it mean? Mikem v'lekulchem. Some of you, but not all of you. Prat lemumar. That excludes the mumar, somebody who is disassociated from Torah Mitzvah, not a part of it. Mikem, but only of you. Bachem chalakti. Amongst Am Yisrael, I made a division between those that still associate with Torah and those that don't. V'leba umas, but not by the non-Jews. Even an idolater, someone who actually serves idols, if he brings a korban to the Beis Hamikdash, we accept it from him. Min ha-behema. Then it says, of the animals. So that's superfluous too. It should just say, of cattle and of sheep. We know of cows, bulls, goats, and sheep. That's sufficient. Why does it have to say first, of the animals, min ha-bakar, min ha-tzon? So min ha-behema, the drash is actually going on the person. It's a possible, there's a person who is animalistic in the sense of that they are unfettered, untrained, unrestrained. They do whatever they want, and nevertheless, they can bring a korban. From here we learn, even wanton, intentional sinners of Am Yisrael, people who really have a lot to fix, nevertheless, they can bring a korban. And why? So that they do fix it, so that they do tshuva. Chutz min hamumar, besides for a mumar, he cannot bring it. And somebody who pours wine libations before idolatry, and before an idol, does idolatry. Somebody who breaks Shabbos wantonly, openly, unabashedly. So the Gemara says, wait, first, I have a contradiction between the first and second lines here. Amra, as you said, one is of you, but not all of you. Well, it's a mumar. That excludes somebody who disassociated from Torah Mitzvah, is no longer a part of Am Yisrael. He's a mumar. And then you tell me, then you tell me, wanton sinners, people who are careless in Torah, can still bring a korban. So we're going to make a distinction. The first part is somebody who's a mumar for the entire Torah, disassociated. It's not that he has 612 mitzvahs, but not the 613. He doesn't have any mitzvahs, nothing. Nothing's binding to him. So for that person, he's a mumar l'chol Torah kula. He can't bring a korban. However, Metzia, the second verse, is talking about mumar l'davar echad, somebody who has mitzvahs. He does Torah, but he doesn't know it all. Some things he's like, yeah, that I don't do that. Yeah, I don't do that. So that person is still within and can bring a korban. Ema sefer. So how do we define the third line, where you have something where it says mumar is not included? Chutz min ha-mumar v'manasach yayin. What's that mumar? If you tell me that someone who disassociated from the whole Torah, we already said that, he can't bring a korban. If it's someone who's disassociated from one mitzvah, that one I don't do, right? Kasha mitzvah. So then in the middle we said that somebody like that can bring a korban. So rather, the last line means this: besides for somebody who doesn't care about the laws of idolatry and serves idols, Or somebody who does break Shabbos publicly without any compunctions, without any shame, doesn't try to hide it. So for that, those two cannot bring a carbon. Alma, so we see that this Bryce's opinion is that idolatry and breaking Shabbos are equivalent. And for them, for this Brysa, for that opinion, somebody who does not, who publicly, unabashedly breaks Shabbos is equivalent to idolatry and can no longer, is really considered disassociated from the whole Torah. Shmamina, and indeed that's the opinion. So that's Rav Huna's opinion. And we have the opinion of Rabbi Meir that says any mitzvah is that way. And the Chachamim say only idolatry. The Mishnah continues. Somebody in the courtyard, remember the way the Eruv works is, really the courtyard or the alleyway are a private domain. And you would be allowed to carry on Shabbos from your house into the courtyard or alleyway. However, since it does service multiple homes or multiple courtyards, so it acts as if it's a public right-of-way. It is a public right-of-way, so it's as if it's a public domain. In order to be able to carry there on Shabbos, everybody has to put a bread in to one basket and put it into one of the homes, and that sort of makes it a single entity space. And you can carry there on Shabbos because now it's clearly not a public way, but a private single entity way. What happens if one person forgot to put in an Eruv? So he will have to relinquish his rights in the courtyard. If he does so, you cannot carry in and out from his house because he's relinquished his rights to the courtyard. However, not only he can't carry, but others also cannot carry from his house to the courtyard. However, but out of the other members of the courtyard or alleyway, he and the others are allowed to carry from their houses back into forth into the courtyard. So he is disassociated from the courtyard. He can carry from their houses, but he cannot carry from his own house, and no one else can carry from his house either. Nasna lo reshusa. If he relinquishes his rights, that would be the right way to do it. What happens if it's the other way around? The Eruv committee, everybody else relinquishes their rights to him. Hu muter, he's allowed to carry from his house into the alleyway, but they may not. Ve'hein asurim, and they're prohibited. And the Gemara is going to ask, why? Before you said that when he relinquishes his rights, he's allowed to carry from their house into the courtyard. Now that they relinquish to him, they can't carry from his house. Why not? Hayu shnayim. The third scenario of the Mishnah is where there are two people that forgot to put in an Eruv. And instead of them relinquishing their rights to the Eruv committee, the committee, everybody else, relinquished to them. But since they're two entities, that's not a valid Eruv. You still have a multiple entity alleyway or courtyard, and it's going to be invalid. So Osim says this, so they prohibit each other from carrying. Because one person can relinquish rights, and one person can receive rights, because it's all going to remain a single entity. Shnayim, if it's two people, they can relinquish their rights, and it'll retain the Eruv committee, the whole group will become one entity. However, if they relinquish to the two, that doesn't work. They cannot receive the relinquishment because then they are two entities and not going to be valid. Fourth part of the Mishnah. At what point do you have to relinquish the rights in order for the alleyway to be able to carry, or the courtyard to be able to carry? So Beishamei say, before Shabbos sets in, you have to do this. And Beisil say, no, you can do it on Shabbos as well. Fifth line in the Mishnah. Fifth halacha. Misha nasa reshusay v'hoitzi. This is what we saw before today and in the past few days. If somebody relinquishes rights to the courtyard and then takes out his lawn chair and puts it into the courtyard, essentially retaking his rights. So Rabbi Meir says the relinquishment no longer works, and he prohibits everybody else from carrying on account of that you don't have a single entity here anymore. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, it depends. Rabbi Yehuda says it depends. B'mezid, if he did so intentionally, so then he reneges on his relinquishment, and it's no longer a single entity in the courtyard. However, b'shegig, if he did so unintentionally, eino aser, it won't prohibit on anybody carrying because it does not count as reneging. So Gemara analyzes the first line. The first line, the Mishnah is missing the main point, that he relinquished. It sounds like just the fact that he forgot to put it in an Eruv is sufficient for him not to be allowed to carry from his house, but the others can carry from their house, and he can carry from their house. So basically, he can't carry from his house, but he can carry in the courtyard. So what's the case? Ida batul, if he relinquished the rights, so why can't he carry from his own house? If he did not relinquish his rights, why can't he carry in the courtyard? So Gemara says, yeah, of course, it's missing in the Mishnah, but it's very clear. What are we talking about? He relinquished, however, he only relinquished the rights of the courtyard. However, he still wants to live in his house, so he retained the rights to his own private apartment. Because Savri Rabbana, and we saw this earlier in the Masechta, a month and a half ago, that what's the halacha? If somebody relinquishes the courtyard, do they also mean to relinquish their house or not? And the Chachamim say no. What's the reason we would think that somebody, if they relinquish their courtyard, they also relinquish the house? So we explain that back then, the houses were very small. Most of the household chores, bathing and washing, laundry, and even cooking, they were all done in the courtyard. You didn't really have space in the house. So if you don't have courtyard space, you actually have, you don't have a proper living space. As a guest, you can live there, but as an inhabitant, you can't really live that way. So yet the Chachamim say that that doesn't mean that you relinquish your rights, because a person could and would be willing to maintain the rights to their own house even though they don't have the courtyard. Even though he relinquished the rights to his house, he did not relinquish the courtyard. He did not relinquish the rights to his house. Because a person can live in a house without a courtyard. It's not easy, it's not typical, but it's possible. Therefore, no one can carry from the house because it's a separate entity. But from all the other houses, everybody, he and they, are allowed to carry from the courtyard to the house and vice versa. Because he's like a guest of theirs, even though that he has his own house, but he can carry in their courtyard and in their house and from one to the other because he's their guest. However, if it's the other way around, instead of him relinquishing his rights to everybody else in the courtyard, everybody else relinquished their rights to him. He can carry from his house into the courtyard because it's a single entity, but they cannot. Why? Why don't we say that they too are like his guests? The Gemara says, one person being the guest in a courtyard of 5 people makes sense. But to have 5 people, the courtyard guests in the courtyard of a single entity, of a single person, that's not going to count. That's not typical. Wait, but the Gemara at this point thinks the meaning of the Mishnah is this. First, he relinquished his rights to the 5 neighbors, to the courtyard, and then the rest of the neighbors relinquished their rights back to him. So we see, and this was a discussion we had a few days ago between Rav and Shmuel, whether you're allowed to relinquish your rights and then have it relinquished back or not. And it seems like in our Mishnah that's going on. So the Gemara says, no, that's not what it means at all. Either he relinquished his rights, or he never relinquished his rights, they relinquished to him. Then it's permissible for him and prohibited for them. Okay, that's the end for today, and we'll continue tomorrow morning. It is Rosh Chodesh, Chodesh Tov, Shavua Tov, a good Vach, and a good Chodesh to everyone.
Chodesh Tov.